The water treatment plant for the town of Harrod, Ohio, sat on a 2-acre municipal lot at the end of Kessler Road, about 400 yards from the Great Miami River. Population 900 and change. 1 traffic light, a grain elevator, a volunteer fire department, a bar called The Paddock that served food until 8 and drinks until whenever Dale felt like closing. The kind of place you drive through on your way to somewhere else and forget by the time you reach the next county line. I took the job in March of 2001. Not as a ranger. I need to be clear about that because everything I'm about to tell you happened during the one stretch of my career when I wasn't wearing a federal patch, wasn't sleeping in a backcountry cabin, wasn't answering to a district office 3 mountain ranges away. I was 46 years old, and I'd just come off 11 consecutive months on a fire detail in the Bitterroots that left me with a torn rotator cuff, 12 pounds underweight, and a marriage that had finally stopped pretending it was going to recover. My wife had moved to her sister's place in Dayton. I was renting a single-wide outside Pequot. My shoulder wouldn't let me swing an axe or carry a pack over 30 pounds, and the regional office told me to take medical leave until the orthopedic surgeon cleared me for full duty. I couldn't sit still. Anyone who's worked wildland fire knows the feeling. You spend a season moving 18 hours a day, eating when you can, sleeping in ash, making decisions that matter, and then someone hands you a couch and a television and tells you to heal. It doesn't work. Your body might be broken, but your mind is still running incident command on everything around you, looking for the next task, the next problem to walk toward. If you're the kind of person who finds some comfort in hearing about strange things that happen in places most people never see, you might consider subscribing. I've got no shortage of stories, and I don't think I'll run out anytime soon. A friend of mine from the Army, Dale Pressler, the same Dale who ran the Paddock, called me in February and said the town's water operator had quit without notice, and they needed someone with a certificate to run the plant while they posted the job. I'd gotten my Class 2 water operator's license years earlier through the Forest Service, back when I was managing a small treatment system for a seasonal ranger compound in the Shoshone. It was still current. Dale said it was easy work, mostly just monitoring the system and filing state compliance reports. And the town would pay me $15 an hour, plus let me use the apartment above the plant office. I said yes before he finished the sentence. It wasn't the money. It was the idea of having somewhere to be every morning. Harrod's water came from 2 sources. The primary was a series of 3 groundwater wells drilled into a limestone aquifer about 200 feet down, spaced along the river bluff south of town. The secondary was a direct surface intake from the Great Miami itself, used only during peak summer demand or when well levels dropped. The treatment process was simple: aeration, lime softening, sand filtration, chlorination, fluoridation, then distribution through about 6 miles of cast iron mains that were older than anyone currently alive in the county. My job was to run the daily tests, adjust the chemical feed, keep the pumps maintained, file the monthly reports with the Ohio EPA, and make sure nobody's tap water turned brown or started smelling like sulfur. The plant building was a flat-roofed concrete block structure built in 1961. 1 main operations room with the chemical feed systems and the filter banks. A small office with a desk and a filing cabinet. A mechanical room in back housing the high-service pumps. Upstairs, a 1-bedroom apartment that had clearly been designed for exactly this purpose, keeping the operator close enough to hear the alarms at night. The apartment was clean, sparse, functional. A window over the kitchen sink looked out across the lot toward the river bluff. A window in the bedroom faced town rooftops, the church steeple, the grain elevator. You could see both directions from up there. I liked that. The first 2 weeks were uneventful in the best possible way. I ran the tests. I filed the paperwork. I learned the system's quirks, the number 2 well. Pump had a bad bearing that made it whine above 60% capacity. The lime feeder clogged if you let the hopper run below a quarter full. The backwash cycle on filter 3 took 11 minutes instead of the standard 8 because someone had installed the wrong valve actuator sometime in the 70s, and nobody had ever corrected it. These were the kinds of problems I understood. Mechanical, predictable, solvable. I ate breakfast at the paddock most mornings. Dale opened at 6 for the farmers and the second shift guys coming off the line at the plastics factory in Sydney. He'd cook eggs and sausage on the same flat top he used for burgers at night, and we'd talk about nothing important while the coffee worked its way through us. The regulars accepted me without much curiosity. Small towns are like that with certain kinds of outsiders if you're doing useful work, thus say, and you don't cause problems. They'll let you exist without requiring your biography. A few people called me Ranger, which Dale must have mentioned, and I didn't correct them. It was easier than explaining the details. The first thing I noticed that didn't fit happened on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week. I was running the daily bacteriological samples standard total coliform and E. coli presence-absence tests that I'd process through the incubator and read the next morning. I pulled samples from the clear well, the distribution header, and 2 points in the system, one at the school and one at the fire hydrant near the church. Routine. I'd done it every day since I started. The clear well sample came back clean, as expected. The distribution header was clean. The school was clean. But the church hydrant sample showed something I hadn't seen before. Not coliform, not E. coli. The presence-absence vials showed no yellow color change and no fluorescence under UV, which meant no indicator bacteria. But the water itself had a faint turbidity that shouldn't have been there. Post-filtration, post-chlorination water in a properly functioning system should be crystal clear. This had a barely perceptible haze, not brown, not yellow, not any color I could name. Just a slight reduction in clarity, as though something was suspended in it that was too small or too transparent to identify visually but large enough to scatter light. I ran the turbidity meter on it. The reading was 0.3 NTU, which was within the state limit of 1.0, but noticeably higher than the 0.04 to 0.08. I'd been consistently getting from the rest of the system. I logged it, resampled the hydrant the next morning, and got 0.05. Normal. I wrote it off as a possible sediment disturbance in the main old cast iron pipes shed rust and calcium deposits if the flow velocity changes, which can happen when someone opens a hydrant somewhere else in town or when the fire department runs a test. It was a reasonable explanation. I moved on. 4 days later, I found the same haze in a sample from a different location, the tap in the elementary school kitchen. Same visual character, same elevated turbidity, same absence of any bacterial indicator. And again, when I resampled the next morning, it was gone. I started keeping a separate log, not because I was alarmed, but because intermittent water quality changes in a distribution system usually point to a developing problem, a main that's starting to fail, a valve that's partially closed and creating turbulence, a cross-connection somewhere that's allowing non-potable water into the system during pressure drops. These are real operational concerns. You don't ignore them. You track them until the pattern tells you where to look. Over the next 2 weeks, I caught the haze 6 more times. Never at the plant itself. The clear well and the distribution header were always clean. Always at different points in the distribution system. Always transient present in the morning sample. Gone by afternoon or the next day. The turbidity readings ranged from 0.2 to 0.6 NTU. Never dangerous. Never accompanied by any bacterial contamination. never consistent enough to isolate to a single section of pipe. I mentioned it to Dale one morning at breakfast. Not as a concern, just as a professional observation. The way you'd mention a funny noise your truck was making. He listened, nodded, then said something that caught my attention. Elmer used to talk about that. Elmer Fitch was my predecessor, the operator who'd quit without notice. What did he say about it? Dale shrugged. Just that the water did funny things sometimes. I never thought much of it. Elmer was... He paused, choosing his words. Elmer was particular. You know the type. Everything had to be a certain way, or it bothered him. He'd been running that plant for 19 years, and by the end he was talking about the water like it had opinions. I smiled at that and let it go. But later that day, back in the plant office, I pulled out the filing cabinet and started going through Elmer Fitch's records. The man was meticulous. 19 years of daily logs, all handwritten in the same cramped, precise script. Chemical feed rates, pump run times, filter head loss readings, bacteriological results, turbidity measurements, pH, alkalinity, hardness, chlorine residual, everything the state required, and quite a bit more. He'd kept a separate notebook for well levels, logging the static and pumping water levels in each of the 3 wells every Monday morning. Another notebook tracked maintenance, every bearing replacement, every valve repair, every chemical delivery, dated and initialed. I found the turbidity notes in the daily logs. Elmer had been recording the same intermittent haze I was seeing. His first entry mentioning it was from June 1994, 7 years before I arrived. A marginal notation next to a routine turbidity reading. Slight haze at Oak Street hydrant, no bacterial, cleared by PM resample. The notations continued sporadically through the mid-90s, maybe one every few weeks. Always the same character, slight haze, no bacteria, transient, different locations. By 1997, the notations became more frequent and more detailed. He'd started logging the locations on a hand-drawn map of the distribution system, marking each occurrence with a small penciled X and a date. I spread the map out on the desk. There were dozens of X marks scattered across it, concentrated in the older sections of town, the original grid of streets surrounding the church, the school, the business district. The newer subdivisions on the east side, served by PVC mains installed in the 1980s, had almost none. That made mechanical sense. Older cast iron mains are more susceptible to internal corrosion, tuberculation, sediment accumulation. If you're going to get intermittent turbidity events from pipe degradation, that's exactly where you'd find them. But Elmer had clearly not been satisfied with that explanation, because in 1998, he'd started doing something I found unusual. He'd begun testing the hazy samples for dissolved mineral content beyond the standard parameters. He was running hardness, iron, manganese, sulfate, all normal for a groundwater system. But he'd also started sending samples to an independent lab in Columbus for more comprehensive analysis. I found the lab reports folded into the back of the 1998 daily log binder. The first 3 were unremarkable typical limestone aquifer water with the expected calcium-magnesium profile. The 4th report, dated November 1998, had a handwritten note from the lab analyst stapled to the cover page. It read, Mr. Fitch sample 98-4417 contains an unidentified organic compound at trace concentration. Not consistent with any standard drinking water contaminant or treatment byproduct. Likely environmental artifact. Recommend resample if persistent. Dio Coro. Elmer had resampled multiple times. I found 7 more lab reports spanning 1999 and 2000, and every one of them flagged the same unidentified organic compound. The concentration was always trace level, barely above detection limits. The lab characterized it as a high molecular weight organic molecule, possibly proteinaceous, but could not match it to any known contaminant, any algal byproduct, any bacterial metabolite, or any polymer used in water treatment. In the final report, dated August 2000, the analyst, the same Diocoro, had written a longer note. Mr. Fitch, we have exhausted standard analytical methods on this compound. It does not match anything in our spectral library. If you want further identification, I can refer you to a university laboratory with mass spectrometry capability. But this would be at significant additional cost. The compound shows no toxicological markers in standard screening. Recommend continued monitoring. Elmer had underlined, does not match anything, twice. I sat in that office for a long time, looking at the lab reports, looking at the map with its constellation of penciled X marks, listening to the steady thrum of the high-service pumps in the next room, pushing water out into the mains beneath the streets where 900 people were cooking, bathing, drinking, living. An unidentifiable organic compound in a municipal water supply is not necessarily alarming. Water is a solvent. It passes through rock, soil, pipe, concrete, and along the way it picks up whatever it touches. Groundwater in limestone country can contain all kinds of naturally occurring organic material, humic acids, fulvic acids, biological compounds from subsurface microbial communities. Most of it is harmless. Some of it is strange. The fact that a commercial lab couldn't identify it meant it was unusual. But unusual isn't the same as dangerous. What bothered me was the pattern, the transient nature of the haze. Its appearance only in the distribution system, never at the plant. Its concentration in the oldest parts of the infrastructure. And the fact that my predecessor had spent 2 years, and what must have been a considerable amount of his own money, trying to identify something that kept appearing in water he was responsible for, and then quit without notice. I went back to the filing cabinet and looked for anything Elmer might have left about his departure. There was no resignation letter. The last daily log entry was dated January 14th, 2001, a Sunday. The readings were normal. The entry was complete. There was no indication that anything unusual had happened that day or that he'd planned to leave. He'd simply stopped coming to work on Monday the 15th. And when the town clerk called his house, the phone was disconnected. Dale told me later that Elmer had moved out of his apartment, this same apartment I was now living in over that weekend. No forwarding address. 19 years. And he left like someone vacating a motel. I found one more thing in the filing cabinet that afternoon. It was in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old chemical safety data sheets. A single sheet of yellow legal paper, folded once, with a note in Elmer's handwriting. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It read, "It is in the pipes. It has been in the pipes for longer than the pipes have been here. It is not contamination. It is not biological in any way I can prove. It comes and goes, but it is always somewhere in the system. I have tested every source. It is not in the wells. It is not in the river. It is not in the treatment process. It enters the water after the water enters the mains. I do not know what it is. I do not know what it wants. I know that it knows the system better than I do. I am not the right person for this." I read that note 3 times. Then I folded it and put it back where I'd found it. Elmer Fitch had worked in water treatment for 19 years. He understood the chemistry. He understood the infrastructure. He'd methodically investigated an anomaly using every tool available to him. And at the end of that investigation, he'd written a note that sounded less like a professional assessment and more like a letter of surrender. The rational part of my mind, the part trained by decades of working in systems where observation leads to explanation, where evidence resolves into cause, immediately began constructing alternative interpretations. Elmer was isolated. Small-town water operators often work alone for years, and that solitude can distort perspective. An unexplained lab result becomes a fixation. A transient turbidity event becomes a mystery. A mystery, without anyone to talk to, becomes something larger than it is. I'd seen similar patterns in fire lookouts who spent too many seasons alone. The human mind will build meaning out of anything if you give it enough silence and enough time. But I'd also been doing this work long enough to know that dismissing someone's observations because their conclusions sound strange is not the same thing as refuting their evidence. Elmer's data was real. The lab reports were real. The turbidity events were real. And I was seeing them too. I decided to approach it the way I would have approached any unexplained finding in the field. I would observe. I would document. I would test. And I would not decide what I was looking at until the evidence told me. The next morning, I started a systematic sampling program more rigorous than anything the state required. I divided the distribution system into 8 zones based on pipe age, material, and distance from the plant. I established fixed sampling points in each zone. 14 total. Every morning at 6, before the town's demand cycle picked up, I drove my route and pulled samples from all 14 points. I tested each one for turbidity, chlorine residual, temperature, and pH on-site. Then brought the full set back to the plant for bacteriological incubation. On days when I found the haze, I preserved the sample for the additional mineral analysis Elmer had been running. The first week of intensive sampling told me something I hadn't expected. The haze wasn't random. It wasn't appearing at arbitrary points in the system. It was moving. Monday morning, I found it at sampling point 3, the hydrant at the corner of Oak and Vine, in the oldest section of town. Tuesday, it was gone from point 3, but present at point 6, the school kitchen, 4 blocks north. Wednesday, clean everywhere. Thursday, it appeared at point 11, the far end of Church Street, the last hydrant before the main dead ended at the old cemetery. By the second week, the pattern was unmistakable. The haze appeared at 1 or 2 points each day, never the same points on consecutive days, always in the older cast iron sections, and always moving not randomly, not following flow direction or pressure gradients, but traversing the system as though it were choosing a path. I mapped every occurrence the way Elmer had, using a fresh copy of the distribution system schematic. After 3 weeks of daily sampling, I had enough data points to see what Elmer must have seen years earlier and what his penciled X marks had been slowly revealing. The haze was following the mains. It moved through the pipe network the way you or I might walk through a neighborhood methodically, covering ground, returning to certain points more frequently than others. The church, the school, the stretch of Oak Street where the oldest houses in town stood shoulder to shoulder with their fieldstone foundations and their deep limestone cellars. It had preferences. I sat in the plant office on a Thursday evening in mid-April, the sampling map spread across the desk beside Elmer's old map, the two of them showing the same pattern 20 months apart, and I felt something shift in the back of my mind. Not fear, not yet. Something more professional than that. The recognition that the problem I was looking at was not a problem I had been trained to solve. A mechanical failure produces consistent symptoms. A chemical contamination has a source. A biological event follows ecological rules growth, nutrient cycling, population dynamics. What I was tracking in those pipes followed none of those frameworks. It moved with apparent intention through a closed system, appeared and disappeared without any detectable input or withdrawal, carried no identifiable biology, and left behind a chemical signature that one of the better commercial labs in the state couldn't match to any known substance. I hadn't told anyone what I was doing, not Dale, not the town clerk, not the state EPA office. The water was meeting every regulatory standard. There was no violation to report. The turbidity events were within limits. The bacterial tests were clean. On paper, Harrod's water system was performing normally. But something was in those pipes. Something that didn't come from the wells, didn't come from the river, didn't come from the treatment process, and didn't match anything that was supposed to exist in a municipal water system. And Elmer Fitch, who had understood that better than anyone, had walked away from it in the middle of a January night and never looked back. I didn't walk away. That was a decision I made consciously, sitting in that office, listening to the pumps push water through the building beneath me and out into 6 miles of old iron mains that threaded through the ground under every house, every business, every church and school, and sidewalk in town. Whatever was in the water was also, in the most literal sense possible, in the town. Had been for years, maybe decades, and 900 people were drinking it, cooking with it, bathing in it every single day, without the slightest idea that anything was unusual. I was the only person who knew, and I was the only person whose job it was to make sure the water was safe. So I kept testing. The systematic sampling continued through the rest of April and into May. I refined my methods as I went. I added a conductivity meter to the field kit, thinking the haze might correlate with dissolved mineral changes. It didn't. Conductivity stayed flat, regardless of whether the haze was present. I started recording the exact time I pulled each sample down to the minute, wondering if the movement through the system followed a time-of-day pattern related to demand cycles. That theory held for about a week. The haze seemed to appear more often in early morning samples, before people were running their taps, and then it showed up at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday at the Oak Street hydrant, while I watched a woman water her garden across the road. And I abandoned that idea too. What the data did show, consistently, was geography. The haze moved through the old cast iron mains almost exclusively. The PVC sections on the east side stayed clean. On May 8th, I went out after midnight with a sampling kit and a flashlight and pulled samples from every hydrant in the system, all 23 of them within a 90-minute window. I found the haze at 3 adjacent points along Church Street, forming a continuous segment roughly 400 feet long. The hydrants on either side of that segment were clear. By the time I resampled the same 3 points at 6 in the morning, the haze had moved east to the school. 400 feet of pipe carrying something that didn't belong there, moving through the system like a body moving through a hallway. I need to explain something about the way old water mains work, because it matters for what happened next. Cast iron pipe, the kind Harrod's original system was built from, develops a layer of internal corrosion over decades. Iron oxidizes. Calcium carbonate precipitates out of hard water and deposits on the pipe walls. Biofilm, a thin layer of harmless bacteria, colonizes the surface. Over 50, 60, 70 years, the inside diameter of a 6-inch main can shrink to 4 inches or less. The walls coated with a rough, layered crust of mineral deposits and biological material called tuberculation. It's normal. Every old water system in the country has it. You manage it with periodic flushing, sometimes with chemical cleaning or relining. And eventually you replace the pipe when it's too far gone. The point is that the interior of an old cast iron water main is not a smooth, sterile tube. It's a complex surface, porous, irregular, layered with decades of accumulated chemistry and biology. If you were designing a habitat for something that lived at trace concentrations in water and needed a surface to anchor to, you could hardly do better than the inside of a 70-year-old cast-iron pipe. That thought came to me on a Sunday morning while I was servicing the lime feeder, and I set the wrench down and stood there for a full minute, because it was the first time I'd thought about the haze as something that lived. Elmer's note had said it wasn't biological in any way he could prove. The lab report said the compound was organic, but didn't match any known biological product. The bacteriological tests were always negative. Nothing I was seeing fit any standard definition of a living organism in a water system. There was no bacterial contamination, no algal growth, no protozoan detection, nothing that would trigger a health advisory or a boil water notice. The water was, by every measurable standard, safe. But it moved. It moved through the system with directionality and apparent preference. It moved the way a living thing moves, not passively, not carried by flow, but against flow, across junctions, through the network, as though it understood the network's geometry. I hadn't slept well the night before. That was becoming more frequent, not because of anxiety, exactly, but because of a low-grade restlessness that came from spending my days circling a problem that wouldn't resolve. The apartment was directly above the plant operations room, and at night I could feel the pump vibrations through the floor, through the bed frame, a constant low hum that I'd found comforting during my first weeks, and now found harder to ignore. I'd lie there and think about the water moving through the mains beneath the streets, and the something moving through the water, and the 900 people sleeping above those mains without any idea that their water operator was mapping something he couldn't name. On May 14th, I did something I probably should have done weeks earlier. I called the Ohio EPA district office in Lima and asked to speak with someone in the drinking water division. I got a field inspector named Grace Portera. I explained who I was, described the system, and told her I was seeing intermittent turbidity events in the distribution system that I couldn't trace to a mechanical cause. She asked the standard questions. What were the turbidity readings? Below 1.0 NTU. Were there any coliform detections? No. Had there been any customer complaints? No. Was the treatment process operating within parameters? Yes. Had I checked the mains for leaks, cross connections, valve issues? I had. It sounds like you're dealing with normal sediment disturbance in old pipe, she said. Those cast iron systems, anything can stir things up. Water hammer, fire department testing, demand changes. If your readings are below the action level and your BAC tests are clean, you're in compliance. Just keep monitoring. I understand, I said. The reason I'm calling is the character of the turbidity. It's not rust, it's not calcium, and it moves through the system. There was a pause. Moves how? Directionally. I've been sampling 14 points daily for 5 weeks. The haze appears at different locations each day, and it tracks through the mains in a continuous path. It's not related to flow direction or demand patterns. Another pause, longer this time. Mr. Ashcroft, are you saying you think something is physically traveling through the distribution system? I'm saying the data shows a turbidity event that changes location in a pattern consistent with directional movement. I'm not drawing conclusions beyond what the data shows. Grace Portera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I can schedule an inspection if you'd like, but I'll be honest with you, if the system is in compliance and there are no health-related findings, there's not much we can do on the regulatory side. Turbidity in old mains is a maintenance issue, not an enforcement issue. I understand. I'd appreciate the inspection. She said she'd come out the following week. I thanked her and hung up, and I sat in the office feeling the particular frustration of having communicated accurate information to a competent person and having it land nowhere, because the information didn't fit any category that triggered a response. I spent the rest of that week tightening my data. I plotted every turbidity event on the distribution map with timestamps, connected the sequential appearances with arrows, and produced a clear visual record of the haze's movement through the system over 6 weeks. Whatever Grace Portera saw in the field, she would not be able to dismiss the pattern. The evidence was specific, repeatable, and documented. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, driving a white state vehicle with the EPA seal on the door. She was about 50, short hair going gray, weathered hands, no-nonsense bearing. The kind of person who'd spent a career looking at things that didn't work and figuring out why. I liked her immediately. I walked her through the plant first. She checked the filter effluent turbidity, reviewed the chemical feed rates, inspected the clear well, tested the chlorine residual at the distribution header. Everything was within spec. She said so, noting her readings on a clipboard. Then I brought her into the office and showed her the maps. She studied them for a long time. I watched her eyes track the arrows I'd drawn, following the haze's path through the streets of Herod, loop after loop, week after week. She didn't say anything for several minutes. "You've been doing daily sampling at 14 points for 6 weeks, she said finally. "Yes." "On your own initiative?" "Yes." She looked at me with an expression I recognized professional respect, complicated by the awareness that what she was looking at didn't have a straightforward explanation. "This is thorough work. Better than most systems 10 times this size. You said you have a Class 2? "Yes, Forest Service originally." "It shows." She tapped the map. "Let me take some of these to the lab. If you've got preserved samples from the haze events, I'll run them through our analytical suite. We've got better equipment than a commercial lab." I gave her 12 preserved samples spanning 3 weeks. She packaged them carefully, labeled each one, and loaded them into a cooler in her vehicle. Before she left, she stood in the parking lot and looked out toward the road, toward the town. "How long has the previous operator been gone?" "Since January. And he was seeing this too. For at least 6 years, probably longer." She nodded slowly. "I'll have the results in 2 weeks. In the meantime, keep doing what you're doing. And Mr. Ashcroft." She hesitated. "Don't discuss this with the public until we know what we're dealing with. If it turns out to be nothing, you don't want to have created a panic over iron sediment." "Agreed." She drove away. I went back inside and ran the afternoon tests and tried to focus on the routine, but my mind kept returning to the expression on her face when she'd studied the maps. She hadn't dismissed anything. She hadn't offered a mechanical explanation. She'd looked at my data the way I'd looked at Elmer's data, with the quiet recognition that the evidence was pointing towards something the standard framework didn't accommodate. While I waited for her lab results, I kept sampling. And in the 3rd week of May, the haze did something new. I was running the morning route at my usual time, 6 o'clock, the town still mostly quiet. Farmers were already up, but the residential streets were empty. I pulled the sample at point 9, a hydrant on Elm Street, midway through the old grid, and held the vial up to the early light. Clear. I moved on to point 10, the corner of Elm and 2nd, 1 block east. Also clear. Point 11, the dead end at the cemetery. Clear. Then I backtracked to point 8, the hydrant at the corner of Main and Church, right in front of the paddock. I opened the hydrant, flushed for 30 seconds as I always did, and filled the sample vial. The water was warm. Not dramatically warm, not hot, but noticeably, unmistakably warmer than it should have been. Groundwater from a limestone aquifer at 200 feet maintains a year-round temperature of approximately 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The distribution system might gain or lose a degree or two depending on the season and the ground temperature around the shallow buried mains. But in May, with the soil still cool from winter, the tap water in Harrod ran consistently between 52 and 56 degrees. I knew this because I'd been recording the temperature at every sampling point every morning for 6 weeks. The water from the main and church hydrant was 68 degrees. I stood there on the sidewalk holding the vial, and I took the temperature again with my calibrated field thermometer. 68.3. 14 degrees above what it should have been. I flushed the hydrant for a full minute and retested. 67.9. The haze was not present. The water was clear. Turbidity was 0.06, perfectly normal. But it was 14 degrees warm, and there was no mechanical explanation for that. The mains in that section were buried 4 feet deep in clay soil that was holding at 48 degrees this time of year. There was no hot water cross connection at a hydrant. Hydrants connect only to the cold water main. The only way that water could be 68 degrees was if something was heating it after it entered the pipe. I drove back to the plant, checked the clear well temperature. 54 degrees. The well water was entering the system at its normal temperature. Whatever was warming the water at main and church was happening inside the distribution system itself. I went back and sampled the hydrant every 2 hours for the rest of the day. By 10 in the morning, the temperature had dropped to 59. By noon, 56. By 2 in the afternoon, it was back to 54, indistinguishable from the rest of the system. The warmth had come and gone the same way the haze came and went, transiently, locally, without any detectable source. I logged it. I added a temperature column to my tracking spreadsheet. And over the following week, I caught 2 more thermal events. One at the school, one at the Oak Street hydrant. Both showed the same profile. A 10 to 15 degree elevation above normal, present in the early morning, dissipating by midday, with no accompanying turbidity change, and no bacterial detection. Something in the pipes was generating heat. I was lying in bed on a Saturday night, the pump vibration humming through the floor the way it always did, when I realized I could hear something else. Not the pumps, not the building settling. A sound that was lower, slower, more irregular, a kind of rhythmic pressure change that I felt in my sternum more than I heard in my ears. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. Then came back, slightly different in character, for another 10 or 15 seconds. Then silence again, just the pumps. I got up and went downstairs to the operations room. The filter banks were running normally. The chemical feed systems were cycling at their set rates. The clear well level was stable. I stood in the mechanical room next to the high-service pumps and listened. The pumps sounded normal, the steady electrical hum, the slight whine from the number 2 bearing. But beneath that, if I held my breath and stood very still, I could feel the low-frequency pressure variation. It wasn't coming from the pumps. It was coming from the pipe. The 12-inch transmission main that carried water from the plant to the distribution system ran through the mechanical room wall and out under the parking lot. I put my hand flat on the pipe. It was vibrating not with the steady mechanical vibration of pump operation, but with something irregular and slow, almost peristaltic, a squeeze and release pattern that repeated every 8 to 12 seconds, varying slightly each time. I grabbed the temperature gun from the tool bench and pointed it at the pipe. The surface read 61 degrees at the spot under my hand. I walked along the pipe to the wall penetration, reading the temperature every few inches. 61, 60, 59, 57, 55. The temperature was highest near the center of the room and dropped off in both directions. Something was in the pipe directly beneath where I was standing. Something that was warm and moving and pushing against the water with a rhythm that felt, in a way I did not want to define, organic. I pulled my hand away from the pipe. I stood in the mechanical room at 1:30 in the morning, alone, listening to the pumps and the pipes and the thing in the pipes. And I made a decision that I would not go upstairs and pretend I hadn't felt what I'd felt. I got my sampling kit. I went to the drain valve on the transmission main, a 2-inch brass valve used for flushing, and opened it slowly over a bucket. The water came out clear, normal pressure, normal flow. I let it run for a minute, then adjusted the valve to a thin stream and filled a sample vial. Temperature, 63 degrees. Turbidity, 0.09. No haze visible. I sealed the vial and held it up to the fluorescent light. Clear. Then I set it on the workbench and watched it. In 30 seconds, the clarity changed. Not immediately. Gradually, the way fog develops, the way breath appears on cold glass. The water in the sealed vial developed the faint haze I'd been tracking for weeks, but I was watching it form in real time, in water that had been clear when I collected it. The haze wasn't something the water picked up from the pipe walls. It wasn't sediment dislodged by flow. It was something that was in the water dissolved, invisible, undetectable, and it was coming out of solution as the water cooled. I opened the vial and took the temperature again. 58 degrees, already dropping. The haze was thickening slightly as the temperature fell. By the time the water reached ambient room temperature 72 degrees in the heated building, the haze had stabilized. Faint, but distinct. I ran the turbidity meter. 0.4 NTU. I stood in the mechanical room, staring at a vial of water that had changed state on its own after collection. And I felt the same thing I'd felt 100 times in the backcountry, when the evidence in front of me stopped fitting the map I was carrying. The map was wrong. Not the territory. The map. The next morning, I drove to the library in Sydney and spent 4 hours reading everything I could find about anomalous organic compounds in groundwater systems. I read about biofilms, about extremophile bacteria that thrive in the deep subsurface in conditions of extreme pressure and temperature and darkness, metabolizing iron and sulfur and hydrogen in ways that surface biology doesn't. About microbial communities discovered in South African gold mines living 2 miles underground, completely isolated from the photosynthetic world above. About the deep biosphere, the vast, poorly understood layer of life that exists in rock and sediment beneath the surface of the earth. Estimated to contain more biomass than all the forests on the planet. I read about organisms that had been found in water wells, in mine shafts, in drilling boreholes, organisms so different from anything on the surface that they barely registered on standard biological tests. Organisms that used chemical energy instead of light. That grew on timescales of centuries. That existed as diffuse chemical presences in water rather than as discrete cells or bodies. None of this was fringe science. It was published, peer-reviewed research from major universities. The deep biosphere was real, enormous, and almost entirely uncharacterized. And it was connected to the surface through every well, every borehole, every crack and fissure in every aquifer that human engineering had ever tapped. Harrod's wells drew from a limestone aquifer 200 feet down. Limestone is porous, fractured, dissolved by millennia of water flow into networks of channels and chambers that can extend for miles. The same geology that made it a good aquifer, high porosity, high transmissivity, also made it a potential habitat for subsurface life. The thought that kept forming, the one I kept pushing away and watching return, was this. What if Elmer's unidentifiable organic compound wasn't a contaminant? What if it was a secretion, a metabolic product of something living in the aquifer, or in the pipe network that connected the aquifer to the town? What if the haze, the warmth, the peristaltic movement I'd felt in the transmission main, what if those were not symptoms of a failing infrastructure, but signs of something that had colonized the infrastructure, something that lived in the boundary layer between water and iron, in the tuberculation crust of 70-year-old mains, in the dark, pressurized, chemically rich environment of a distribution system that had been running continuously for longer than most of the people it served had been alive. What if the pipes hadn't developed a problem? What if something had developed the pipes? Grace Portera called me on June 4th, 3 weeks after she'd taken the samples. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, "I need to come back out." Her voice was controlled, professional, but I could hear the same quality in it that I'd been hearing in my own thoughts for weeks, the careful restraint of someone who has found something that doesn't fit and isn't sure yet how to hold it. "What did the lab find?" I asked. "It's easier to show you. I'll be there Thursday morning." She didn't elaborate. I didn't push. I spent the next 2 days doing my job, running the tests, pulling the samples, logging the data. The haze appeared and disappeared. The thermal events continued. The pipes hummed their low, slow rhythm at night. I lay in my apartment and felt the water move beneath me and tried to remain professional about something that was becoming very difficult to professionalize. Grace arrived Thursday at 9 with a manila folder and a man I hadn't met, thin, early 30s, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a collared shirt that looked like he'd slept in it. She introduced him as Dr. Paul Mettler, a microbiologist from Ohio State's Environmental Science Department. He shook my hand and immediately asked to see the plant. I walked them both through the facility. Mettler asked detailed questions about the treatment process, what oxidant I used, what the contact time was, what the chlorine residual measured at the far ends of the distribution system. I answered everything. He knelt beside the transmission main in the mechanical room and put his hand on the pipe the way I had. And I watched his expression change when he felt the vibration. "How long has it been doing this?" he asked. "I first noticed it 3 weeks ago, but I wasn't checking before that, so I can't say when it started." He kept his hand on the pipe for a long time. Then he stood up and looked at Grace, and something passed between them that I recognized as a conversation they'd already had before they arrived. We went into the office. Grace opened the manila folder and spread the lab reports on the desk beside my maps. I could see immediately that these were different from the commercial lab reports Elmer had gotten. More detailed, more pages, with graphs and spectral analyses I didn't fully understand. "The compound is real," Grace said. "It's present in all 12 samples at varying concentrations. Our lab confirmed it's an organic macromolecule. High molecular weight, proteinaceous base, with a lipid component we haven't fully characterized." "It's not a contaminant," Mettler said. "It's not a treatment byproduct. It's not an industrial pollutant. And it's not any microbial metabolite in any database we have access to." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "Ms. Portera described your sampling data. The movement pattern, the thermal anomalies. I'll be candid with you, Mr. Ashcroft. I came out here because I thought she was misinterpreting sediment transport in an old system. I've been sitting in this building for 40 minutes, and I no longer think that. What do you think it is? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the pipe running through the wall, then back at me. I think something is living in your distribution system, he said. Something we haven't seen before. Mettler wanted samples from inside the pipe. Not water samples, biofilm samples. Material scraped directly from the interior wall of a main, preferably from a section where I'd documented repeated haze events. The problem was access. You can't just open a pressurized water main and scrape the inside. The system was live, serving 900 people. Any work on the mains required shutting down the section, draining it, cutting into the pipe, and then repairing and disinfecting before putting it back in service. That meant coordinating with the town, notifying customers of a water outage, and explaining why. I told Mettler and Grace that I'd need to present it to the town council as a maintenance inspection, which was technically true. Old mains need periodic assessment. Nobody would question a request to cut a coupon, a small section of pipe from a problematic area for inspection purposes. I'd done it in other systems. The process was standard. Grace agreed to frame it as an EPA-recommended infrastructure evaluation, which gave it official weight without triggering public concern. Mettler would be present as a university consultant, assisting with the assessment. We scheduled it for the following Tuesday, choosing a section of 6-inch main on Oak Street that had shown the highest frequency of haze events and 2 thermal anomalies in the past month. The 5 days between that meeting and the pipe cut were the longest of the spring. I continued my sampling routine, but my attention had shifted. I wasn't just tracking the haze anymore. I was watching the system the way you watch an animal whose behavior you're trying to predict, looking for patterns of movement, for rest periods, for reactions to changes in the environment. And I noticed something I hadn't caught before. The haze events correlated with demand. Not with high demand, with low demand. The clearest pattern appeared between 2 and 5 in the morning, when water usage in town dropped to near zero. During those hours, the pumps cycled down to minimum output. The pressure in the mains stabilized, and the flow velocity in the pipes approached stagnation. That was when the haze appeared most frequently and most intensely. When the town woke up and started drawing water showers, coffee, the first flush of the morning, the haze dissipated rapidly, pushed out by the increased flow or diluted below detection. It was active when the system was quiet. It withdrew when the system was busy. I also started paying closer attention to the sound. The low-frequency pressure variation I'd felt in the transmission main was not constant. Some nights it was strong enough to feel through the floor of my apartment. Other nights it was absent entirely. I began logging it the way I logged everything else. Date, time, estimated duration, perceived intensity. After 10 days, I had enough data to see that the rhythm appeared most reliably on the same nights the haze was most widespread in the system. High haze activity, strong pipe rhythm. Low haze, no rhythm. They were linked. Whatever was moving through the pipes was, in some way I couldn't yet define, breathing. Tuesday arrived. Grace came early, without Mettler, to help me prepare. We notified the 6 households on the affected section of Oak Street that they'd be without water from 9 in the morning until approximately 2 in the afternoon. Nobody complained. Small-town infrastructure work is a fact of life, and people kept a few jugs in the pantry without being asked. At 9, I closed the isolation valves on either side of a 50-foot section of main that ran beneath the street between the Pressman House and the old Methodist parsonage. The section had been on my high-frequency list since April haze detected there on 11 of the 43 sampling days. I opened the blow-off valve and let the section drain into the storm sewer. It took about 20 minutes. The water came out clear at first, then progressively cloudier normal for a draining main, as the reduced pressure releases sediment from the pipe walls. The last water out of the pipe was not cloudy. It was thick, not mud thick, not rust thick. It had a viscosity slightly higher than water, and a color I had never seen in any pipe I'd ever worked on, a pale, translucent amber, like very dilute honey. It flowed out of the blow-off in a slow, steady stream for about 90 seconds, and then the pipe was empty. I caught the amber discharge in a clean 5-gallon bucket. Grace looked at it without speaking. The liquid was warm to the touch. I measured it at 71 degrees, 17 degrees above the groundwater temperature. It had no odor. It was slightly viscous when I poured it from one container to another, forming a brief, thin strand before breaking, the way a light syrup would. Mettler arrived at 10:15, later than planned because of traffic on I-75. He looked at the bucket first, before looking at the pipe. He crouched beside it, dipped a gloved finger in, rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, held it up to the light. He didn't say anything. He took 3 sample containers from his kit, filled each one carefully, sealed and labeled them. Then we went to the pipe. The town's maintenance crew, 2 men, Jerry Cole and his nephew Travis, had already cut the pavement and excavated down to the main. The pipe sat in a narrow trench 4 feet deep, bedded in gravel and clay. It was 6-inch cast iron, heavily tuberculated on the exterior, with the mottled brown-black patina of decades of contact with damp soil. Standard. I'd seen hundreds of pipes just like it. Jerry's crew made the coupon cut 2 circumferential cuts 12 inches apart using a hydraulic pipe saw and lifted the section out with a chain. It was heavy for its size, which I attributed to the wall thickness and the internal buildup. They set it on a sheet of plywood beside the trench. I looked inside the pipe. The interior was not what I expected. Normal tuberculation is rough, nodular, rust-brown layers of iron oxide and calcium that build up in irregular formations over decades. It looks like the inside of a cave, scaled down. What I was looking at was smooth. The entire interior surface of the pipe was coated with a uniform layer of material, roughly a 1/4 inch thick. It was the same pale amber color as the discharge we'd collected. In texture, it looked dense and slightly glossy, like the lining of an organ. It was continuous, no gaps, no thin spots, no nodules. It coated the interior circumference completely, reducing the effective pipe diameter from 6 inches to roughly 5.5. Mettler put on a headlamp and examined the coupon closely, turning it in his hands. He touched the amber layer with a gloved finger. It was firm, but yielded slightly under pressure, springing back when he released it elastic, resilient. He pressed harder, and the surface dimpled around his fingertip without tearing. "This is not tuberculation," he said. "No," I said. "This is not biofilm." "No." He looked up at me, then at Grace. "I need to take this back to the lab." "The whole section?" Grace asked. "All of it, intact. I don't want to scrape a sample. I want the complete structure, undisturbed. If this is what I think it might be, the spatial organization matters." We wrapped the coupon in plastic sheeting, packed it in a cooler surrounded by ice packs, and loaded it into Mettler's vehicle. He left immediately, driving faster than I thought an academic usually drove. Jerry and Travis fitted a repair sleeve over the cut section, pressure tested it, chlorinated the line, flushed it, and by 1:30 the system was back in service. The 6 households on Oak Street had water again. Nobody had called to ask what was going on. I sampled that section of Maine the next morning at 6. Clean. 0.05 NTU. 54 degrees. No haze, no warmth. As though nothing had ever been there. But 2 blocks south, at the Church Street hydrant, the haze was back. Stronger than I'd measured before. 0.8 NTU, just under the regulatory limit. And the water temperature was 64 degrees. It had moved away from the section we'd cut. Moved or withdrawn. I stood at that hydrant holding a vial of hazy, warm water, and I thought about what it would look like from the inside. A 12-inch cut through a continuous lining that had taken how long? Years, decades, to establish. A sudden intrusion of air and light into a pressurized dark space that had been sealed since the pipe was laid. The removal of a piece of itself. And then, within hours, a shift in concentration to an adjacent section, as though the system's entire colonized network had redistributed around the wound. That was not the behavior of a biofilm. Biofilms don't redistribute. They grow in place, and when you remove a section, the adjacent areas are unaffected. What I was observing was a connected response. A single system reacting to local damage by shifting resources elsewhere, like an organism responding to an injury. Mettler called me 4 days later. It was a Friday evening, and I was sitting on the steps outside the plant watching the sun go down behind the grain elevator. My phone rang, and his name came up. And the first thing he said was, "Are you sitting down?" I told him I was. "The lining material is cellular," he said. "Not in the way biofilm is cellular. It has differentiated cell types. At least 3 that we've identified so far, possibly more. There's a basal layer anchored to the iron surface, a middle layer with high metabolic activity, and an outer layer in contact with the water that appears to be secretory, producing the compound the labs have been finding." I listened without interrupting. The cells are eukaryotic, not bacterial, not archaeal. Eukaryotic, with membrane-bound nuclei and organelles. But the cellular architecture doesn't match any known eukaryotic lineage. Not fungal, not protist, not plant, not animal. The genetics, he paused. We've extracted DNA. It amplifies, it sequences. The ribosomal RNA genes have recognizable conserved regions, but the variable regions don't cluster with anything in GenBank. It's not on the tree. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. "It means this organism is so distantly related to every known form of life that our current phylogenetic framework doesn't have a place for it. It's eukaryotic, which means it shares a deep common ancestor with everything from yeast to humans. But the divergence is ancient. Hundreds of millions of years, minimum. Possibly longer. It's been evolving independently in a subsurface environment for a span of time I can't estimate with the tools I have." He was speaking faster than usual, the careful academic diction giving way to something less controlled. "There's more," he said. "The outer secretory layer, the part in contact with the water, isn't just producing the compound passively. The cells are responsive. When we expose the tissue to changes in water chemistry, pH shifts, temperature changes, chlorine exposure. The secretory output changed. Qualitatively, different compounds under different conditions. It's not just living in the water, Mr. Ashcroft. It's tasting the water. It's monitoring the chemistry and adjusting its output in response." Adjusting to do what? We don't know yet, but here's what I can tell you. The compounds it secretes under normal conditions, the ones you've been detecting as the haze, are not toxic. They're not pathogenic. Preliminary assays show no cytotoxicity, no mutagenicity, no immunological activity. If anything, and I want to be very careful here because these are early results, if anything, the compounds appear to have mild antimicrobial properties. I sat with that for a moment. You're saying the thing in the pipes is producing something that kills bacteria? That suppresses microbial growth. Yes. Which might explain why your bacteriological tests have been consistently clean, despite having an extensive biological colonization of the pipe network. The organism may be actively maintaining the water quality within its habitat. The sun had gone below the grain elevator. The sky was pale orange, fading to gray. Somewhere down the street a dog was barking and a screen door slapped shut. I could hear a television through an open window, someone watching the evening news. 900 people in their houses, living their lives on top of 6 miles of pipe that contained something that wasn't on the tree of life. Something that had been growing in the dark beneath their streets for longer than anyone could guess. Something that was, if Mettler's early results were right, cleaning their water for them. "Paul," I said, "what do you want to do?" He was quiet for a few seconds. "I want to map the full extent of the colonization. I want to know how far it reaches, how it's distributed, what sections are most heavily colonized. I want to understand its metabolism, what it's consuming, what it's producing, what energy source it's using. I want to do a full genomic analysis, not just ribosomal markers. And I want to do all of this without damaging it any more than we already have." "You took a 12-inch section out of it." "I know, and it redistributed within hours. That tells me the entire colonized network is physiologically connected. It's not patches of growth. It's one organism, or one integrated colony, spanning the pipe system. When we cut that section, we essentially took a biopsy of something that might extend for miles." I thought about the map on my desk upstairs, the haze events tracked for weeks moving through the system, the thermal anomalies, the nighttime rhythm in the pipes, not symptoms of infrastructure failure. Vital signs. "The town council is going to need to know eventually," I said. "Not yet. Please. If this goes public before we understand what it is, 2 things happen. First, someone panics and orders the system flushed with high-concentration chlorine, which might kill an organism that's been maintaining water quality for decades. Second, every microbiologist in the country descends on Harrod, Ohio, and the political pressure to do something visible will override any chance of studying it carefully. These people are drinking it, Paul. They've been drinking it for years, possibly for the entire life of the system. And their water quality has been excellent. No disease clusters, no unusual health patterns, nothing. Whatever this organism is doing to the water, the evidence so far suggests it's beneficial." He was right about the health data. I'd checked. Harrod had no unusual disease rates, no cancer clusters, no pattern of gastrointestinal illness. The town's water had consistently met or exceeded state standards for as long as records existed. If the organism had been harming people, there should have been some signal in 50 years of public health data. There wasn't, but I was the water operator. My legal and ethical obligation was to the safety of the public water supply. I was required to report any condition that might affect water quality to the state EPA. Grace already knew, which meant the state was technically informed. But she had framed this as an infrastructure assessment, not a biological discovery. If I formally reported the presence of an unidentified organism in the distribution system, the regulatory machinery would activate. Boil water advisories, emergency disinfection, possibly a complete system shutdown and replacement. And if Mettler was right, if this thing was actually keeping the water clean, then the regulatory response designed to protect public health might destroy the very thing that had been protecting it. I told Mettler I would give him the summer. 3 months. He could study the coupon, analyze the samples, build whatever picture the science supported. I would continue monitoring the system daily. If at any point I detected a health risk, bacterial contamination, toxic compounds, anything that suggested the organism was changing its behavior in a way that threatened the water supply, I would report it immediately and accept whatever consequences followed. He agreed. Grace agreed, with the stipulation that she would continue receiving copies of my daily monitoring data. We had a 3-person arrangement built on professional trust and a shared awareness that we were in territory none of us had been trained for. June passed. I ran the plant. I pulled the samples. The haze continued its slow, methodical transit through the old mains. The thermal events continued, always in the early morning hours, always dissipating by midday. The nighttime rhythm in the transmission main continued, and I began to recognize variations in it. Nights when the pulse was faster and shallower. Nights when it was slow and deep. Nights when it paused for long intervals and then resumed in a different pattern. I logged all of it. I had notebooks full of data that no water treatment manual in the country would have recognized as relevant. I ate breakfast at the paddock most mornings. Dale and the regulars talked about the weather, the corn, the high school baseball team, the new Dollar General going in on Route 117. Nobody talked about the water. Why would they? The water was fine. It had always been fine. One morning in late June, Marge Pressman, whose house sat directly above the Oak Street section we'd cut into, stopped me as I was walking back to the plant from breakfast. Marge was 70-something, small, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who noticed everything and said about half of it. "You're the new waterman," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Elmer used to walk around at night. I'd see him from my kitchen window, 2, 3 in the morning, out there with his ear against the fire hydrant, like he was listening to something. I figured he was crazy. "Are you crazy too?" I smiled. "I hope not. My grandmother used to say the water here was sweet. Not like well water, not like river water. Sweet, like it had something good in it. She lived to 97. My mother lived to 94. I'm 78, and I've never been to a hospital except to have my children. We've been drinking this water for 4 generations. She looked at me with an expression that was neither question nor accusation. "Whatever you're doing with those test tubes, I hope you're not planning to fix something that isn't broken." She walked back into her house and closed the door. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time after that. Marge Pressman's family had been drinking the water in Harrod for 4 generations. Her grandmother lived to 97, her mother to 94. 3 women, spanning a century, drinking water from the same mains that I now knew, were lined with an organism that predated any classification system humans had built. And they'd thrived. Coincidence, maybe. Genetics, diet, lifestyle. 100 variables that epidemiology would want to control for before drawing any conclusion. But the observation sat beside Mettler's preliminary finding that the organism's secretions showed no toxicity and possible antimicrobial properties, and together they formed a picture that was becoming harder to look away from. The organism wasn't just living in the water system. It was part of the water system, part of the town, in the most literal way anything could be. It was in the pipes under every street, connected to every house, flowing through every faucet. The town had been built around it, or on top of it, or through it. And for decades, maybe for the entire history of the municipal water supply, it had been doing something to the water that the people of Harrod experienced as normal, as sweet, as good. In the first week of July, I started checking the wells. Mettler had assumed the organism entered the system from the aquifer through the wells, It was the logical pathway the wells penetrated 200 feet of limestone, tapping into an aquifer that connected to the deep subsurface environment where this kind of life might originate. But my sampling data had never shown the haze at the plant itself. The clear well was always clean. The well water coming in was always clean. The haze appeared only into the distribution system, in the old cast iron mains. I pulled samples from each of the 3 wells at the wellhead before the water entered the treatment process. Clear, cold, normal. I ran them through the full battery. Nothing. I preserved samples and sent them to Mettler. He found no trace of the compound. I checked the river intake, even though it hadn't been used since the previous August. No trace. Then I went into the clear well, the underground concrete tank where treated water was stored before distribution. I climbed down the access ladder with a flashlight and a sampling kit. The clear well was 12 feet deep, concrete walled, holding about 40,000 gallons. The water was clear and cold, the chlorine smell sharp. The walls were bare concrete with the normal mineral staining you'd expect. No amber lining, no unusual coating. Clean. The organism was not in the source water. It was not in the treatment process. It was not in the storage. It existed only in the distribution mains, the old cast iron pipes buried beneath the streets, which meant it had not come from below. Or if it had come up through the mains themselves, from whatever was at the bottom of them, where they terminated in the ground, at dead ends and closed valves and old abandoned connections that led nowhere any map showed. Or it had always been there, before the pipes, in the soil, in the clay, in the limestone bedrock beneath the town. And when the pipes were laid in the 1920s and 1930s, pushed down through the earth and joined together and filled with water and sealed in darkness and pressure, they became, for something already living in that ground, the best habitat it had ever encountered. Iron-rich walls, flowing oxygenated water, stable temperature, a connected network of tunnels spanning an entire town. Not contamination, colonization, not invasion, opportunity. I was sitting in the plant office late on a Thursday night, the maps and logs spread across the desk, the pump vibration steady in the floor, the low rhythm audible in the pipes if I held still long enough. When the phone rang. It was Mettler. "I need to come back," he said. "I've got the genomic results." "When?" "Tomorrow." He arrived at noon on Friday, looking like he hadn't slept in 2 days. Grace came with him. We sat in the office with the door closed and the window unit laboring against the July heat. And Mettler opened his laptop and showed me what his team had found. The genome was large, larger than most known eukaryotes. The coding regions were dense, with minimal junk DNA, which suggested intense selective pressure over a very long evolutionary history. The predicted protein structures included families that had no homologs in any existing database enzymes, structural proteins, signaling molecules that appeared to be entirely novel. But scattered among the unknown were fragments that were recognizable conserved sequences shared with fungi, with certain deep-branching protists, with organisms that occupied the most ancient nodes of the eukaryotic tree. "Our best estimate," Mettler said, "is that this lineage diverged from the rest of eukaryotic life sometime in the late Proterozoic, possibly 800 million years ago, possibly more. It's been evolving in isolation in the deep subsurface ever since. It's as different from anything on the surface as animals are from plants, more different maybe." He showed me electron micrographs of the cells from the pipe lining. They were large 10 to 20 times the size of a typical human cell. The internal structures were complex, with multiple nuclei per cell, and an extensive network of internal membranes that he said appeared to function as a distributed chemical processing system. The cells were connected to each other by physical bridges, fine tubes that linked adjacent cells into a continuous network, allowing the direct exchange of materials across the entire tissue. This is how it coordinates, he said. This is why the whole system responds when you cut a section. The cells aren't independent. They're physically connected throughout the entire pipe network. It's one tissue, one body, spread across 6 miles of pipe, connected cell to cell, sharing resources and information. He pulled up another image, a cross-section of the amber lining at high magnification. 3 distinct layers, as he described on the phone. But now, he pointed to something in the outer layer, the secretory surface in contact with the water. See these structures? They're sensory. They're chemoreceptors, molecular sensors that detect specific compounds in the water flowing past them. Chlorine, calcium, pH indicators, organic carbon. And this is the part that kept me up all night: breakdown products of human metabolism. Urea, creatinine, hormones, pharmaceutical metabolites. I looked at him. From the water? From the wastewater. Harrod's sewer system runs in the same trenches as the water mains, in some places within 18 inches of them. Old clay tile sewers, cracked and leaking. There's infiltration in both directions. Groundwater gets into the sewers, and sewage leaks into the soil around the water mains. It's common in old towns. The organism's sensory layer is detecting the chemical signature of the town's population through soil-mediated contact with the sewer leachate. He let that settle. It can sense the people, he said. Not individually, but collectively. It's monitoring the biochemical output of the community through the sewer system, and it's adjusting what it puts into the water supply in response. The window unit cycled off for a moment, and in the silence I could hear the pumps, and beneath them, the rhythm. Slow, steady, a squeeze and release every 10 seconds, pushing the organism's secretions out into the water that would flow through every tap in town within hours. Adjusting how? I asked. We don't know yet. We've identified at least a dozen distinct compounds in the secretory output, and the relative concentrations shift depending on environmental conditions. Some appear to be antimicrobial. Those are the ones we identified first. Others are more complex. Some of them have structural similarities to known bioactive molecules, immunomodulators, anti-inflammatories. Grace, who had been listening without speaking, leaned forward. Are you suggesting this thing is medicating the town? Mettler took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. I'm suggesting that this organism has been living in a symbiotic relationship with a human community for at least 70 years, possibly much longer. It draws chemical information from the population through the sewer system. It responds by modifying the composition of the drinking water. The people of this town have been consuming its secretions with every glass of water, every shower, every meal cooked with tap water, for generations. And they are, by every available health metric, unusually healthy. Nobody spoke for a while. The window unit kicked back on. Outside, a truck passed on Kessler Road. Marge Pressman, I said. They both looked at me. Marge Pressman, 78 years old, never been hospitalized. Her mother lived to 94, her grandmother to 97. 4 generations on this water. Mettler nodded slowly. I want to do a health survey. Quietly. Longevity data, disease incidence, hospital utilization rates. Compare Harrod to demographically similar towns in the region. If this symbiosis is real, it should show up in the population data. And if it does, I asked. He put his glasses back on and looked at me directly. Then we're looking at something that changes the way we understand the relationship between human infrastructure and subsurface biology. This isn't an anomaly, Mr. Ashcroft. This is a discovery. Grace closed her notebook and set it on the desk. It's also a regulatory nightmare. If the state health department finds out there's an unidentified organism in a public water supply producing uncharacterized bioactive compounds, they will shut the system down. They have to. The precautionary principle doesn't leave room for, but the organism might be helping. And if they flush the system with concentrated chlorine to kill it, and the water quality drops, and the health outcomes change, we'll have destroyed something we can't recreate for compliance with a regulation that wasn't designed for this situation. She looked at both of us. So what do we do? That was the question. Not what was the organism, not how did it work, not what was it producing. What do we do? 3 people in a concrete block building at the end of a dead-end road, sitting on knowledge that didn't fit any professional category any of us belonged to. Responsible for a town that was flourishing inside a relationship it didn't know it had. I looked at the maps on the wall, the haze tracks, the thermal events, the rhythm I'd learned to hear at night. 6 miles of old iron pipe laced with something 800 million years old. Tasting the town through its sewers, adjusting the water in ways I was only beginning to imagine. Connected cell to cell in a living network that had turned the municipal infrastructure into the largest organism any of us had ever encountered. And 900 people who just thought they had good water. We made our decision that afternoon, the 3 of us, sitting in the plant office with the door closed and the July heat pressing against the windows. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no argument, no moral crisis, no agonized debate. We were 3 professionals who understood the shape of the problem and the limitations of the systems we worked within. And we arrived at a course of action the way experienced people usually do, by recognizing which of the available options would cause the least harm. Mettler would continue his analysis at Ohio State, working with the samples he had and additional water samples I'd send him weekly. He would not publish until he had a complete characterization of the organism and its secretory compounds. When he did publish, the location would be anonymized. Grace would maintain the infrastructure assessment framing with her office and would not escalate to the health department unless my monitoring data showed a change in water quality that constituted a genuine health risk, and I would stay. That last part wasn't discussed as a decision. It was understood. The temporary water operator job I'd taken to keep myself busy while my shoulder healed had become something else entirely, and all 3 of us knew it. I was the only person with daily access to the system. I was the only person who could monitor the organism in real time, detect changes in its behavior, and intervene if necessary. Walking away meant handing the system to whoever the town hired next, someone who would either miss the signs entirely or find Elmer's note in the bottom drawer, and face the same bewildering progression I'd gone through alone, without the support I now had. I called the regional office and told them I was extending my medical leave. My shoulder was improving, but not ready for full duty, which was true enough. They didn't push back. A desk-bound ranger on medical leave working a municipal water job in rural Ohio wasn't generating any administrative friction. I was, for the moment, invisible to the federal system that had employed me for 23 years. And that invisibility was useful. July settled into a rhythm. I ran the plant. I pulled the samples. I tracked the haze, the thermal events, the nighttime pulse. The organism moved through the system with its usual slow deliberation. And I moved through my days with a version of the same. The 2 of us occupying the same infrastructure in parallel, connected by the water that flowed between us. I started noticing things that weren't in any of my measurement protocols. Small things. The hydrant at Main and Church, the one in front of the paddock, the one that had given me the first thermal anomaly, had a slightly different taste when I sampled it during a haze event. Not unpleasant, not chemical, just different. A faint mineral sweetness that wasn't present in the non-haze samples. I tested it on the instruments and found nothing outside normal parameters. The difference was below what the chemistry could resolve. But my tongue could detect it. The way your tongue can detect differences in spring water that a lab analysis would call identical. Sweet. The word Marge Pressman's grandmother had used. I noticed that my sleep had changed. Not worsened, changed. In the apartment above the plant, lying in bed with the pump vibration in the floor and the organism's rhythm in the pipes below, I was sleeping more deeply and more consistently than I had in years. I'd spent most of my adult life sleeping outdoors, in fire camps, in backcountry cabins, on the ground, on cots, in places where the body never fully stands down because the environment demands partial alertness, even in unconsciousness. Sleep in the wilderness is functional, not restorative. You wake up capable, not rested. In that apartment, I was resting, genuinely. Waking up at 5:30 feeling like the sleep had reached into parts of me that had been running on deficit for decades. My shoulder, which had been stiff and painful every morning since the injury, started loosening faster. The chronic ache in my lower back, a souvenir of 20 years of carrying heavy packs over rough terrain, diminished to the point where I stopped thinking about it. I was eating better, thinking more clearly, moving through the days with an energy that didn't match my age or my physical condition. I logged that too. Not in the official plant records, but in a separate notebook I kept in my apartment. Personal observations. Subjective, unverifiable, scientifically useless, but real. I wrote them down because I had spent my entire career trusting my own perceptions as field instruments, and I was not going to stop now because the data was uncomfortable. I mentioned the sleep change to Mettler during one of our weekly calls. He was quiet for a moment, then asked me to describe it in detail. I did. He asked about other changes, appetite, mood, physical pain, cognitive function. I told him what I'd noticed. He typed while I talked. "You're the person with the highest continuous exposure," he said. "You're living directly above the main system header. You're drinking the water, showering in it, breathing the steam from it every day. If the organism's secretions have systemic bioactive effects, you'd be the first person to notice them. Should I be concerned?" He thought about it. "I don't know. That's the honest answer. The toxicology data is clean. No cellular damage, no mutagenic activity, nothing that trips any alarm we know how to build. But those assays are designed to detect harm, not benefit. If what you're experiencing is real, if the organism's output is having positive physiological effects on the people consuming it. Our testing framework literally doesn't have a way to flag that. We test for what's wrong. We don't test for what's unusually right. In early August, Mettler sent me preliminary results from the health survey he'd been conducting through public records and state health department data. He'd compared Harrod to 4 demographically similar small towns in western Ohio, similar population, similar income, similar age distribution, similar distance from hospital services. The comparison covered 20 years of data. Harrod's residents had a 14% lower rate of hospitalization than the comparison average. Cancer incidence was 21% below the regional mean. Cardiovascular disease mortality was 19% lower. Average lifespan was 4.3 years longer. The differences were statistically significant, even with the small population size, because the effect was large and consistent across every metric. There were confounders, as there always are. Maybe Herod's population was self-selected for hardiness. Maybe the farming lifestyle provided benefits the comparison towns lacked. Maybe there was a genetic component. Small towns often have less genetic diversity. And if the founding population carried favorable alleles, the descendants might show better health outcomes for reasons that had nothing to do with the water. But the simplest explanation, the one that fit all the data, from Mettler's biochemistry to the town's health statistics, to the testimony of Marge Pressman standing on the sidewalk telling me her family had been thriving for 4 generations, was that the organism in the pipes was doing what Mettler's early results suggested. It was maintaining the water. It was modifying its output in response to the population's biochemical signals. And the people of Harrod were living longer, getting sick less often, and experiencing a quality of health that exceeded every comparable community in the region. A symbiosis, ancient, unintentional, unrecognized. Something from the deep subsurface had found its way into the human infrastructure and made itself useful. And the humans had rewarded it without knowing it by maintaining the pipes, keeping the water flowing, preserving the dark, stable, connected environment it needed to survive. Both parties had benefited. Neither party had been aware of the relationship. Until now. I sat with that knowledge through the hottest part of the summer, running the plant, pulling the samples, watching the organism move through its daily patterns. I came to know its rhythms, the way you come to know the rhythms of a place you live. The tempo of activity in the early morning hours. The quieting during peak demand. The slow resurgence in the evening as the town settled. The nighttime pulse became familiar, almost comforting, a presence in the building that was not human but was not hostile. Not alien in the way that word usually implies, just profoundly other. Something that had been alive in the dark for longer than complex life had existed on the surface, and was now, through an accident of geology and engineering, participating in the life of a small Ohio town in a way no one had planned or imagined. I stopped trying to understand it in terms I'd been trained with. Water treatment, contamination, compliance, risk assessment. Those frameworks had brought me to the organism, and they were necessary. I never stopped monitoring, never stopped testing, never stopped being ready to act if the data changed. But they were not sufficient. They couldn't contain what I was actually looking at, which was not a problem to be solved, but a relationship to be maintained. In late August, I made a trip to Dayton to see my wife. We hadn't spoken in months. The marriage was over in every practical sense, but there were papers to discuss. A house to sell, the accumulated logistics of 2 decades of shared life to sort through. I drove down on a Saturday morning and met her at a restaurant neither of us had any memories in. She looked at me across the table and said, "You look good." I didn't know how to answer that. I looked good because I'd been sleeping well and eating well, and my body felt better than it had in years. And the reason for all of that was something I couldn't tell her or anyone else. "The job agrees with me," I said. "The water job? In that little town?" "Yeah." She studied me the way she used to, back when we were still in the habit of paying real attention to each other. "You're different," she said. "I don't mean the weight or the color in your face. Something else. You look like you're paying attention to something." "I am." She waited for me to explain. I didn't. Not because I was keeping a secret from her exactly, but because the truth that I was monitoring an 800-million-year-old organism living in a municipal water system and possibly improving the health of the entire town was not something I could say out loud in a restaurant in Dayton and expect to be received as the statement of a rational person. We signed the papers. She got the house. I drove back to Harrod in the late afternoon. And when I walked into the plant and heard the pumps and felt the building's particular vibrations settle into my body, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt like I was coming home. September brought the first complication. The town council had been running the job posting for my replacement since April, and in September they got an applicant. A young man named Kevin Harbaugh, recently certified Class 1 operator, looking for his first full-time position. The council was ready to hire him and let me go. I'd been a temporary fix, and they had a permanent candidate. I went to the council meeting. 5 people on folding chairs in the community room of the fire station. A town that ran its government with the same modesty it ran everything else. I told them I'd like to stay. I said the system had some ongoing issues. I was still working through the mains, needed further assessment. There were operational refinements I wanted to complete, and continuity of knowledge mattered in a system this old. All of which was true. They looked at me with polite confusion. The water was fine. There hadn't been a complaint all year. Why would a man with a career in the federal system want to stay in Harrod running a water plant for $15 an hour? I didn't have an answer that would make sense to them. I couldn't tell them about the organism. I couldn't tell them about Mettler's research or Grace's regulatory maneuvering, or my own slowly crystallizing conviction that the most important job I would ever hold was not fighting fires in the Bitterroots or tracking wildlife in the Brooks Range, but keeping the water flowing through 6 miles of old iron pipe in a town most people couldn't find on a map. Dale spoke up. He was on the council, and he'd known me long enough to read the situation even if he didn't understand the specifics. "Let him stay," he said. "He's doing good work. Kevin can apprentice under him. 2 operators are better than 1 for a system this age." The council agreed. Kevin started the following Monday. He was earnest, capable, and entirely unaware of what was living in the infrastructure he was being trained to operate. I showed him the standard procedures, gave him the daily routine, walked him through the treatment process, the chemical feed, the sampling protocol. I did not show him Elmer's note. I did not show him my maps. I did not tell him about the haze, the thermal events, the nighttime rhythm, the organism, the compound, the health data, any of it. That was a choice I made deliberately, and I have spent a great deal of time since then examining whether it was the right one. My reasoning was this. Kevin was 24 years old. He had a Class 1 license and no field experience. If I told him what was in the pipes, I would be handing him a burden that had driven Elmer Fitch out of town, and that I was only managing because I had 3 decades of experience dealing with things that didn't fit. The knowledge would either terrify him or fascinate him. And either reaction would be dangerous. Terror might lead him to trigger the regulatory response that Grace and I were carefully avoiding. And fascination might lead him to interfere with the organism in ways we couldn't predict. The better strategy, I decided, was to train him well enough that he'd notice the signs on his own eventually, when he was ready, and to make sure I was still around when that happened. The organism had been coexisting with Harrod's water operators for decades, first invisibly, then through Elmer's private investigation, now through my more systematic monitoring. If the relationship was going to continue, it needed to survive the transition between caretakers, not through secrecy, but through patience. I was planning for continuity, not for myself, and I wouldn't stay in Harrod forever, but for the organism and for the town, and for the invisible bond between them that I had stumbled into the role of witnessing. October came. The leaves turned. The fields outside town went gold and then brown. The demand cycle shifted as the weather cooled, less outdoor watering, shorter showers, the system settling into its winter rhythm. The organism responded. I watched its pattern contract, the haze events becoming less frequent, the thermal anomalies smaller in magnitude, the nighttime pulse slower and deeper. It was, I realized, seasonal. It had an annual cycle, just like everything alive. Summer was its active period, when the soil was warm and the water usage high and the sewer chemistry rich, with a metabolic output of 900 people living their outdoor lives. Winter was its rest, a reduced state, metabolism throttled down, maintaining the pipe network with minimal output while it waited for the warmth to return. An organism with an 800 million year evolutionary history, pacing itself to the agricultural calendar of a small Ohio town. There was something in that observation that I found unexpectedly moving. Not poignant, exactly. Not sentimental. Just the recognition that life, all life, no matter how ancient or how strange, responds to the conditions it finds itself in. Adapts. Participates. Makes the best of what it has. On a night in late October, I was lying in bed listening to the organism's slow winter pulse through the pipes, nearly asleep, when the rhythm changed. It accelerated. Not dramatically, from roughly 1 pulse every 12 seconds to 1 every 8. I got up and went downstairs. The transmission main was warm under my hand, warmer than I'd felt it since August. I checked the instruments. Everything at the plant was normal. Pumps running standard, clear well levels stable, chlorine residual on target. I drove the sampling route at midnight. Every hydrant I tested was clean, normal temperature, no haze. Whatever was happening inside the mains, not in the water. The organism was doing something that didn't involve its secretory output, something internal. I came back to the plant and sat in the mechanical room with my hand on the pipe, feeling the accelerated pulse for nearly an hour. It gradually slowed. By 2 in the morning, it was back to its winter baseline. I went back to bed and lay there in the dark, thinking. In the morning, I called Mettler. He listened, then said, "Did anything unusual happen in town yesterday?" I thought about it. There was a water main break on Elm Street. Jerry's crew repaired it yesterday afternoon. They had to shut down a section for about 3 hours. Silence on the line. "You cut into the system," he said. The repair required cutting out the damaged section and fitting a new sleeve. When they did that, they opened the pipe, exposed the interior, damaged the lining. Probably, yes. I wasn't on site for the repair. And that night, the organism's pulse rate increased. It was responding to the injury, mobilizing resources, repairing itself. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Every time the town's maintenance crew fixed a leak, replaced a valve, cut into a main for any reason, they were injuring the organism. And every time, probably for decades, the organism had repaired itself overnight while the town slept. A wound-healing cycle that no one had ever noticed because no one had ever been monitoring the right frequencies at the right time. The pipes needed the organism. The organism needed the pipes. The town maintained the pipes. The organism maintained the town. A cycle of mutual sustenance, invisible, unintentional, operating beneath the surface of daily life. In a place where people got up in the morning and drank their coffee and went to work, and came home, and never once thought about what was flowing through the walls of their houses, because the water was fine. The water was always fine. I stayed in Harrod for 3 more years. During that time, Mettler completed his analysis. The organism, he never gave it a formal taxonomic name, by mutual agreement. To protect the location represented a lineage of eukaryotic life with no close relatives in any known database. Its genome suggested a divergence from the main eukaryotic trunk in the late Proterozoic. consistent with an organism that had retreated into the deep subsurface before the Cambrian explosion and evolved there independently, while the surface world built everything from trilobites to cities. Its metabolism was chemolithotrophic at baseline. It could live on the iron and minerals in the pipe walls alone, but it had developed a secondary capability that Mettler described as biochemical mutualism. It could sense the chemical environment of its host system, produce compounds tailored to that environment, and receive chemical feedback that informed its ongoing output. In a natural setting, a limestone aquifer, a deep cave system, this capability might have allowed it to maintain relationships with subsurface microbial communities, producing antimicrobials that suppressed competitors and nutrients that supported allies. When it encountered the municipal water system, it did what any successful organism does. It adapted its existing capabilities to the available niche. The pipe walls became its substrate. The flowing water became its medium. The town's sewer chemistry became its sensory input. And the people became, in a sense it had no way to intend or understand, its symbiotic partners. Mettler published 2 papers. The first described the organism's cellular biology and phylogenetic position, using anonymized samples and a fictitious collection site. It appeared in a respected journal and generated moderate academic interest as an example of deep biosphere eukaryotic diversity. No one connected it to a small town in western Ohio. The second paper, on the organism's biochemical capabilities, was more carefully handled. Mettler described the compound production and chemosensory abilities in theoretical terms, framing them as potential mechanisms rather than observed behaviors in a functioning water system. He was protecting the discovery the only way an academic can, by publishing it in pieces too abstract to trigger intervention. Grace Portera retired from the Ohio EPA in 2003. Before she left, she quietly reclassified Harrod's water system as a low-priority inspection site, citing its consistent compliance record and the operator's extensive monitoring program. This meant the system would receive routine state inspections only once every 3 years instead of annually, reducing the chance that a new inspector would stumble onto something the regulatory framework wasn't equipped to handle. Kevin Harbaugh learned the system. He was good at the work, careful, consistent, attentive to detail. In his second year, he came to me one morning and said he'd noticed something odd in his early sampling. A faint haze at one of the Oak Street hydrants, turbidity slightly elevated, gone by the time he resampled. I looked at him and decided he was ready. I showed him the maps, I showed him Elmer's logs, I showed him the lab reports, Mettler's papers, the temperature data, everything. I took him into the mechanical room at midnight and put his hand on the pipe and let him feel the pulse. He stood there for a long time, not speaking, his palm flat against the iron, his face passing through the same sequence of expressions I imagine mine had passed through a year and a half earlier: disbelief, then focus, then a slow, careful realignment of everything he thought he understood about the job he'd been hired to do. "What do I do?" he asked. "You keep the water flowing," I said. "You monitor. You don't panic. You don't report. You take care of the system, and the system takes care of the town. That's the job." He nodded. He didn't ask if I was crazy. He'd been drinking the water for a year and a half, and he knew what it tasted like. He knew how he felt. I left Harrod in the spring of 2004. My shoulder had healed fully, had healed better than the orthopedic surgeon expected, in fact, which I noted privately without comment. I returned to the Forest Service, took a posting in the Alleghenies, went back to the work I'd spent my life doing. Dale threw me a going-away dinner at the paddock. The regulars came. Marge Pressman came and told me I'd done a good job with the water, which from her was the highest possible compliment. I shook Kevin's hand and told him to call me if anything changed. He said he would. He did call, once, about 6 months later. The organism had shown a new behavior. The haze events had begun occurring in a section of PVC main on the east side that had previously been clear. It was spreading, slowly, into the newer infrastructure. Kevin had documented it carefully, the way I'd taught him. "What should I do?" he asked. "Log it," I said. "Track the pattern. Let me know if the chemistry changes." It didn't change. The organism grew slowly into the new pipes, the way it had once grown into the old ones, the way any living thing expands into available habitat when conditions allow. The water stayed clean. The town stayed healthy. I drove through Harrod once, years later, on my way to somewhere else. It was a fall evening, the light going amber over the fields, the grain elevator casting a long shadow across the road. I slowed down at the corner of Main and Church. The paddock was still there. The hydrant was still there. Green paint over old iron, connected to the main below, connected to everything below that. I didn't stop. There wasn't any reason to. The water was flowing. Kevin was monitoring. The organism was doing what it had done for longer than anyone could measure, adjusting, maintaining, participating in the life of a place that had built itself unknowingly around the oldest resident it would ever have. I thought about Elmer Fitch, who had understood something was there and walked away because he believed he wasn't the right person for it. I thought about Marge Pressman, who had never needed to understand it to benefit from it. I thought about Grace and Mettler, who had recognized the limits of their own systems and worked within those limits to protect something that no system was designed to accommodate. And I thought about 900 people going about their lives in a town where the water was sweet and nobody knew why. And maybe that was exactly as it should be. Some things you carry with you don't weigh anything at all. This was one of them. Not a burden, not a secret exactly. More like a piece of knowledge that changed the way I saw everything after every pipe, every well, every water system, every place where human infrastructure reaches down into the ground and connects to whatever has been living there since before we arrived. We build on top of the world. We push our pipes and our cables and our foundations down into it. And sometimes what's already there reaches back, not with hostility, not with indifference, but with something that looks, from the right angle, like an offer. I don't know what to call it. Symbiosis is the scientific term. Marge would have called it good water. Dale would have shrugged and said it worked, so why mess with it? Elmer Fitch, in his note in the bottom drawer, had written that he wasn't the right person for it. I think about that sometimes. I don't know if I was the right person either. But I stayed long enough to see what it was, and I left it in hands I trusted. And the water is still flowing in Harrod, Ohio, through pipes that are older than anyone alive and lined with something older than anyone can imagine. That's the best I could do. Most of the time, that's the best any of us can do.